Lockdowns and China are synonymous with each other these days, but when the pandemic first hit, they were the first country to start removing people's rights. They locked down the entire state for months on end, and they were pretty brutal lockdowns as well. Some people literally starved to death in their own homes, locked in place by the CCP, who was supposed to supply them with food. Everything got a little bit dystopian very quickly. There were videos of people being executed by Chinese state officials in hazmat suits, and even more videos of people being locked in cages after getting positive tests. Of course, lockdowns were bad pretty much all over the world, but they were absolutely abhorrent across China. Now, the economic hit of those lockdowns was very real too. These people were not going to work, and that meant they weren't doing their work. They weren't earning their salaries, and they weren't being productive. Businesses started to suffer, small ones especially, as work from home was simply not possible. China is not a service-based economy, despite what a lot of people would have you believe, so working from home is far less commonly available to Chinese citizens than it is to people in the West. The Chinese economy is based around manufacturing, as we all know. They are the workshop of the world, and all of those workshops were shut down in the biggest cities across China for months on end. That is now starting to happen again, with more lockdowns coming into force, and the end of this policy just doesn't seem to be in sight at all. There is some crazy things going on, and frankly, you need to know what's happening, so that's what we're going to talk about today. So what exactly is going on in China? Well, their zero COVID policy is still 100% active. Over the past few months, there have been a lot of rumors coming out, notably from the CCP themselves, saying that this zero COVID policy might end, but in the end, those rumors were just that, rumors. We have just seen three massive cities, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and Dalian, all being locked down once more. Now, Shenzhen has about 20 million people in it, Guangzhou has about 15 million people in it, and Dalian has about 8 million people in it. The first two cities there are bigger than any city in the entirety of the United States, and Dalian is about as big as New York as well. To make matters worse, those are only the recent cities that have been put under lockdown. Chengdu has also been shut down. 4 million people in Beijing have been locked down as well, and Tianjin has been shut down. There are literally too many cities to mention here, and just because you don't recognize some of those names doesn't mean that they're small cities and they're inconsequential when it comes to manufacturing for the world stage. We're talking about multiple cities across China the same size as New York or even bigger that we've never heard of before in our lives being shut down entirely. These lockdowns are affecting an insane amount of people. Now, it just so happens that these people have also learned over the last 2 years just how bad these lockdowns can get. The CCP is not benevolent, they are cruel and indifferent to their citizens, and so these Chinese citizens are starting to take matters into their own hands. This here is a video of Chinese citizens fighting to get as much food as possible because they know they're going into lockdown. The Communist Party is supposed to supply people with food in their homes once they're shut down, but these people know better. Plain and simple, they're not going to trust something that essential to the CCP, so they rush outside to the markets and they buy as much food as they physically can, and who can blame them? The big problem with this, though, is that these people are supposedly living in a COVID hotspot and now they're fighting with each other over food. So how on earth is a policy that causes this supposed to reduce and eventually wipe out the spread of COVID altogether? Well, simply put, it isn't going to when this is how it works, but it actually gets worse than that. While some people stock up on food when a positive test is found, others simply try to run away. This video behind me here is of an IKEA store in China where a positive test was recorded, so the police tried to lock every single person inside the store up immediately. These people are terrified of basically going to jail through no fault of their own, so instead they force their way out of the building there. This video here is of people trying to flee a region of a city going into a lockdown before they are stopped by lines of police who fight them off to keep them locked down in that region. Now, not only are these policies brutal, but they simply just don't work because the people in China are so terrified of the lockdowns that they'll do anything they can to get away with them, regardless of whether or not they actually have COVID and are contagious. Everything is about self-preservation there now, which will only make COVID worse in the long run. Now, this is already starting to impact China's economy in a number of different ways. If you're a regular viewer of the channel, then you know about the housing market crash and probably the banking collapse and the railways crash as well in China. But these lockdowns are having a massive impact on the Chinese economy too, and they simply can't be ignored. 35% of China's GDP right now is in lockdown. Now, that's the largest amount that we've seen in a way over a year, and the effects of this are ridiculously large for the Chinese economy. But that really is a video for another day, and a very long one at that, because today we're going to look at what this means for us, those of us outside of China. Now, there are two big important things for us to consider here in the West. We don't live in China, and frankly, none of my viewers do either because YouTube is illegal there. So why are these lockdowns so relevant to us? Well, because they will impact supply and demand all over the world. The supply impact is very obvious, and it's exactly what we saw over the last 2 years. The supply chain crisis has proven to be responsible for anywhere between 30 and 40% of the inflation in the United States today. Factories across the world, but in China in particular, shut down because of COVID, but demand for their products remained high, and in many cases for things like microchips, demand actually rose as those factories shut down. This led to massive shortages in things like cars, washing machines, computers, cameras, and anything digital at all. It caused loads of inflation because there was less supply, and so prices rose, which was very natural. Those aren't the only problems though. There were massive supply problems with shipping times as well. Loads of container ships were just outright scrapped as the pandemic started because their owners thought they would be too expensive to maintain to keep them around while they were doing nothing. Demand for shipping though didn't fall at all, and suddenly there was not enough logistical capacity for shipping products, and so backlogs started. We saw delays, massive delays at ports all over the world. The worst one in the West probably being LA, with hundreds of ships simply sitting out to sea waiting for their turn to port. Now, these delays in transport times and things like that also reduce supply and also increase prices, and that was a massive component of inflation. This time around, we should expect some kind of a similar effect there. Factories across China are shut down once more, and they are centered around population centers, and those cities, they are simply in lockdown. With this reduced production, supply will decrease and prices will rise as a result. It should not be as bad as we saw in 2020 or 2021 though, firstly because the West isn't going into lockdown at the same time, and on our fronts, actually, as far as COVID goes, things are a-okay. There are ports in China that are suffering though. Shenzhen is shut down for lockdowns, as I mentioned earlier, and that is one of the biggest singular port cities in the country, and actually one of the biggest in the world, on top of being a major manufacturing district as well. There will be continued supply disruption all over the world because of China's lockdowns. There's just no way around this in the short term, but it will not be as bad as it was in the past. Still though, it's not going to be good. There is, though, another problem to pay attention to regarding China's lockdowns, and that is the demand side of these impacts in China. And here it's actually kind of good news, at least in my opinion. Now, being locked away in your home does mean that you don't do any working, but it also means you don't do any consuming. These Chinese citizens, they can't go out to dinner, they can't go shopping, and businesses can't invest in themselves because they aren't able to operate. This all dampens the economy in China, and it will also dampen demand. Demand for worldwide products like iPhones in China will reduce, and that should have an impact on the availability of those products over where we live and help to actually lessen the impact of supply side issues over here. Commodities will also see that same effect. China's demand for them is falling because of these lockdowns and because their economy is falling too. Copper is often called Dr. Copper because its price is an indicator of the health of the worldwide economy. So where are prices for copper then? Well, they're down 20% over the last year as a worldwide recession is starting to impact demand. China's lockdowns will contribute to that recession in China and everywhere else too. As a result of this, commodity prices falling really wouldn't be off the cards, and I actually go so far as to expect it over the next year. Now, whether or not this is good news is actually up to you. What do you fear more? Runaway inflation for the next 10 years or a worldwide recession that lasts the next 2 years? Personally, I fear that inflation more than that recession, and so I do think that this is good news, but there is no right answer here. What is clear though is that China's lockdowns have far-ranging consequences that will impact all of us, no matter how detached from China you think you are.